In this video, we combine some of the most disturbing cave diving tragedies we've covered on this channel so far. From divers who got lost in the silt to divers who made a wrong turn and struggled to find their way out. If you enjoy watching these videos, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more exciting cave diving stories like these. Two military men went to explore the depths of the Yucatan Peninsula in southern Mexico. On their way out, they got lost in the passages and couldn't locate the exit. While searching for an exit, they kicked up silt, thereby drastically reducing visibility. Will they make it out in time? The Yucatan Peninsula, located in southeastern Mexico, is one of the largest limestone platforms in the world. This expansive landform, which measures approximately 181,000 square kilometers, is home to a diverse array of natural wonders that continue to captivate visitors from around the globe. Among these wonders are the cenotes, which are natural pits or sinkholes that result from the collapse of limestone bedrock, exposing groundwater. Unlike other regions with visible rivers, the Yucatan Peninsula is a porous limestone shelf with no visible rivers. Instead, all the freshwater rivers are underground. This unique geological formation, combined with the region's tropical climate, has made the cenotes a vital source of fresh water for the people of the Yucatan for centuries. The ancient Maya, who once inhabited this region, were among the first to recognize the value of these natural wonders and make use of them for water supplies. The Yucatan Peninsula alone boasts an estimated 10,000 cenotes, which are located throughout the region in Mexico. These water-filled sinkholes, formed by the collapse of limestone, are an awe-inspiring sight to behold. The water that gathers in these subterranean cenotes is a crystal-clear turquoise color and maintains a very pleasant temperature of 78 degrees Fahrenheit, making them ideal for swimming and other aquatic activities. Julian McDonald is a highly trained U.S. Air Force pararescue jumper and a member of one of the most elite and specialized units in the military. As a tightly muscled 32-year-old, Julian is no stranger to danger, having repeatedly plunged from helicopters and swam against powerful currents. His unwavering courage and unparalleled skill have earned him a well-deserved reputation as a hero among his peers. He's an adventurer with a passion for extreme sports like ice climbing and hang gliding. He always relishes a new challenge and thrives in the face of seemingly impossible tests. During one of their missions, Julian had an opportunity to meet Steve Jackson, and the two of them hit it off from the start. Although both share a love for cave diving and exploring, Steve's approach is slightly different from Julian's. He may not be as daring as Julian, but he is no less adventurous. Steve is always extremely careful, taking the time to meticulously inspect his equipment and ensure that everything is in perfect working order before embarking on any new expedition. Despite his meticulousness, Steve is never one to shy away from a challenge. He's always eager to explore new territory and test his limits, but he does so with a great deal of caution and respect for the risks involved. Moreover, Steve is a devoted husband and a loving father to his 2-year-old son. He takes great pride in his family and is always looking for ways to balance his adventurous pursuits with his responsibilities at home. Julian and his friend and dive buddy Steve had long dreamed of exploring the underwater cave system of the Yucatan Peninsula, with its vast network of submerged caves and rivers. Though Julian was the more experienced and daring of the two friends, they shared a passion for adventure. They arrived at the cave early that morning, eager to make the most of their time and exit before evening. Before they started their dive, Steve took a few minutes to speak on the phone with his wife, informing her of their dive plan and exit time. He wanted to make sure that she knew where he was and when he would be back, and he promised to meet her in New York 2 days later. Once they finished their call, the two friends set off into the jungle, carrying their camera kit, dive tanks, and GPS sets. The dense foliage and swarms of mosquitoes made their progress slow and difficult, but they were determined to reach their destination. After several hours of hiking, they finally arrived at the entrance to the cave. Using their expertise and training, Julian and Steve attached a rope ladder to the base of a thick tree, carefully securing it in place to ensure their safe descent. They then donned their wetsuits and equipment and climbed down the tight hole. As they descended deeper into the cave, the darkness grew more and more intense, and they could feel the cool, damp air against their skin. At the bottom of the hole, they emerged into a vast underground chamber, the roof towering some 3.2 feet above the surface of the water. The inside of the cave was roughly 131 feet in diameter. The water they were standing in was the entrance to a vast underwater river system, one of the largest and most complex in the world. As Julian and Steve made their way through the tight underwater caves, they have to navigate carefully, trying to find a passage that connects to the other system. It's a difficult task, but they are determined to explore and discover something new. Despite the darkness, they keep their lights on, panning them around to get a better look at their surroundings. The cave is truly impressive, with small bats flying around and an island with stunning stalagmites and stalactites that formed during the Little Ice Age when the water level was lower. As they continued their exploration, they spent about 20 minutes moving deeper into the cave system. However, they soon came across a tight passage, and Julian signaled for them to turn around, as it appears to be a dead end. Steve takes over leading the way, but when he arrives at the point where they had entered, he can't seem to locate the exit. This causes him to signal for Julian to pass him and try to find the way out, but even Julian is unable to locate it. Exploring an underwater cave system requires a keen sense of awareness and attention to detail. The divers must rely on their instincts and knowledge to navigate through the darkness and narrow passages. As Julian and Steve continued to search for a passage that would lead them to the bigger underwater river system, they remained focused on the flow of the water, which would serve as a critical indicator of their location. However, as they descended further into the cave, the conditions began to deteriorate, and the water became increasingly silted out, which made it even more difficult to see and navigate through the tight spaces. Despite their best efforts to stay together, Steve became separated from Julian as they continued to search for an exit. As they bumped into each other a couple of times, they continued searching alone to maximize their efforts. Julian realized that he would soon be running low on air, and with conditions worsening by the minute, he had to act quickly to find a way out. As he moved carefully, he stirred up even more silt, which made it nearly impossible to see, and he struggled to breathe as the dust from the cave ceiling rained down on him. Finally, after nearly an hour of searching and feeling increasingly desperate, Julian stumbled upon a tight passage. He knew that a fully kitted diver couldn't pass through, but he had to find a way out. Julian removed his side mount cylinders and passed them through the gap before squeezing himself through, untangling a snagged regulator along the way. However, as he emerged on the other side, he realized that his gas levels were dangerously low, and he had to exit the cave as quickly as possible. Julian grabbed the cylinders by the valves and made his way toward the exit, praying that he would make it out alive. As he emerged from the murky water and gasped for breath, Julian could feel the weight of his scuba gear dragging him down, reminding him of his narrow escape. But he had no time to rest or relax, for he knew he had to act quickly and decisively to save his friend. With a sense of urgency and concern, Julian scrambled up the rope ladder as quickly as he could. His heart was racing with fear and anxiety, knowing that his friend was still trapped down there, possibly struggling for his life. As Julian stood above, catching his breath, he scanned the horizon with his eyes, looking for any sign of Steve, but there was nothing but silence and darkness. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that his friend was still deep down in the cave system, alone and helpless. With a heavy heart and trembling hands, Julian made his way to the authorities and reported the situation, explaining in detail what had happened. He reported that his friend was trapped in the water. He was questioned about what had happened, while two divers were kitted up for the rescue dive. The rescue divers carefully descended the rope ladder, and as they reached the bottom, a stream of bubbles caught their attention, and a shot line was swiftly deployed, securing them in place. One of the divers bravely ventured out to see if he could locate anything, while the others worked to prepare a stage cylinder that could be attached to the shot line. The stream of bubbles, initially strong and forceful, gradually weakened and eventually stopped after about 10 minutes of searching. Despite the divers' efforts, no significant discoveries were made, and coupled with the fact that the area was entirely silted out, the mission was incredibly dangerous. It was decided that the search would need to be postponed until the next day, when visibility would have returned and the conditions would be more favorable for the divers to proceed safely. After the emergency services arrived, a medic quickly checked over Julian, taking care to examine him for any symptoms of distress or injury. Although there were no immediate signs of trouble, Julian was placed on oxygen as a precautionary measure and transported to a recompression chamber for further treatment. There, he received the necessary care and attention to ensure his safety and well-being, and the team breathed a collective sigh of relief that the situation had been handled with professionalism and care. The rescue team returned the next day with renewed determination to locate Steve. Only now it became very likely that the rescue will turn into a recovery operation. Police divers were called in to investigate the various passages in the cave, scouring every nook and cranny for any sign of Steve. The search was a difficult process, as the divers had to navigate through the complex maze of underwater tunnels and caverns, carefully checking every possible hiding spot. Despite their best efforts, it was not until several hours into the search that Steve's body was finally discovered. He was located in an air pocket that was half full of water, with his head above the water's surface. It was a heartbreaking sight, and the divers worked quickly to bring his body to the surface. Unfortunately, Steve had passed away, and the cause of death was not immediately clear. The coroner examined his body carefully, trying to determine the cause of death. It appeared that Steve had suffocated from a lack of oxygen, but the coroner could not say for certain whether he might have become asphyxiated on air filled with carbon dioxide. He did note, however, that Steve's dive tank still held plenty of air, indicating that his death was likely due to some other factor. The news of Steve's tragic passing got to his wife, who was devastated and inconsolable. His friends and family were left reeling with shock and grief. His body was taken to his ancestral home and laid to rest there. Chris Jewell, a British explorer, led a team of cavers to the lowest depth ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere, the Sistema Huautla cave system in Mexico. This groundbreaking exploration led to them spending up to 10 nights underground and sleeping in the caves. Would they be successful? Sistema Huautla is a remarkable cave system located in the Sierra Mazateca Mountains within the southern Mexican state of Oaxaca. It's located very far away, deep within the earth, and holds a special significance for cave explorers from all around the world, especially those from the United States and the United Kingdom. For the early American explorers who ventured into this region, Huautla became a passion. This remarkable cave was first discovered in the 1960s and quickly earned a distinction as being the deepest cave in the Western Hemisphere. It also secured a place among the top 10 deepest caves globally. In terms of length, it ranks 28th, with about 55.3 miles of surveyed passageways, in contrast to the expansive Mammoth Cave complex that spans over 420 miles. Sistema Huautla stands out as one of the most complex deep caves on our planet. It has 17 entrances and countless separate pathways that go deep, plunging to an astonishing depth of 5,118 feet beneath the surface. Exploring Sistema Huautla is like taking a journey through time because it has a rich history of exploration. The pioneers who ventured into this cave helped invent new tools and methods that have since become essential for modern cave exploration. Chris Jewell is a prominent cave diver who's known for exploring caves all over the world. He's not just an adventurer, he's also part of the British Cave Rescue Council. In one of his caving interests, Chris decided to take on the task of exploring the intricate passages of the Sistema Huautla cave system in Mexico. To make this happen, he had to make some special arrangements. First, he negotiated to take 9 weeks of unpaid leave from his regular job. Then, in Manchester, he worked as a software consultant, helping people with computer programs. It's quite a change from his cave explorations. Later on, Chris reached a high point as the head of professional services for the Access Group, a corporate job. There he oversees a team of more than 40 ERP consultants, which means he leads a group of experts who help businesses use their computer systems effectively. But when he's not in the corporate world, Chris is out there exploring the hidden parts of caves all over the globe. He maps out passages that no one else has seen before, witnessing the incredible beauty and mysteries that lie beneath the surface of the earth. The exploration of Sistema Huautla has been an ongoing adventure for the past 50 years. Over this half-century, numerous daring expeditions took place, and these missions are the reason why the cave system is as long and deep as it is today. Back in 1979, during the San Agustin expedition, a significant discovery was made. Explorers realized that if they wanted to delve even deeper into the cave system, they had to either dive underwater or climb upward. This marked the beginning of underwater exploration in Sistema Huautla. Most of the diving expeditions in the cave system from that point onward were led by Dr. Bill Stone, an engineer with a relentless passion for developing new techniques for diving in deep, submerged parts of caves. His dedication to this endeavor led to innovations like the CIS Lunar Rebreather, a special piece of equipment designed for this challenging type of diving. Dr. Bill's work has been instrumental in advancing our understanding of caves like Sistema Huautla. From 2001 on, not much happened in the sumps of Sistema Huautla. Things remained quiet until 2013, when Chris had a plan. He wanted to explore Sump 9, which is a challenging underwater section of the cave. To do this, he assembled a strong team, including British cave diver Jason Mallinson. The journey to dive into Sump 9 began with carefully planned preparation that began a year earlier in 2012. Their goal that year was to send a small team into the field, like a scouting mission, to pave the way for a much larger expedition in 2013. Their main target was to conquer Sump 9, which they nicknamed the Mother of All Sumps. So during the 2012 reconnaissance mission in San Agustin, they achieved all their objectives. They also left behind equipment like bolts and ropes in the cave, making it easier to set up for the dive down to the sump in 2013. This careful planning and groundwork were essential for their successful exploration of this challenging cave system. In the following year, Chris took charge and put together a diverse team of 47 cave explorers from around the world. For their home base, the team chose the village of San Agustin, just as previous expeditions had done. Within a matter of days, they had set up a pathway down the famous San Agustin cave, preparing it for the transportation of their equipment. Once this rigging was completed, Jason was all set to go. He skillfully replaced the guidelines in the underwater passage, extending them to Camp 6. Camp 6 was established back in 1994 by Dr. Bill Stone and Barbara Emende, marking a significant point in the cave's history. After the underwater passageways were secured, the team began moving all the necessary equipment for a 5-person team down into the cave. They used specially designed dry tubes to protect their gear as they transported it through the challenging sumps. The team used the village of San Agustin as their main camp, just like they've done in previous expeditions. Within a few days, they set up a path through the famous San Agustin cave to move a lot of equipment. In total, they brought 1,102 pounds of equipment when they started on February 28th. After setting up the path, diver Jason Mallinson was all set to go. He managed to replace the line to Camp 6. Right behind him, they began moving the 1,102 pounds of diving gear down the cave. They took apart the rebreathers and carried their parts separately. They put regulators in Darren drums and kept dry suits and underclothes in roll-top dry bags to keep them dry. To make it easier, they set up places in the cave where they could leave bags for the next team. Soon there were piles of bags at these spots in the cave. They would quickly be taken and moved even deeper into the cave by a group of cavers working together. The team reached Camp 3, which is about 2,378 feet below the surface, and they set it up again quite quickly. This camp was important because the first group of campers, including Jason Mallison, Mark Wright, Martin Holroyd, Pete Ward, Tim Allen, and Jarvis Frost, needed to prepare for the underwater part of their expedition. Jason had the task of replacing the lines in the sump. Surprisingly, just a week after they started exploring the cave, Jason was all set to take his first dive in Sump 1. This is ahead of their scheduled time. He got some help from Mike Bottomley, Tom Baker, and Andy Cusick to get into the water. His mission was to put a new guideline through the underwater part of the cave. This underwater section, called a sump, had a guideline put in back in 1994, but after 19 years, it was in bad shape. Only bits and pieces of the original line remained. Jason used his KISS rebreather and managed to replace the guideline in both Sump 1 and Sump 3 in one dive. It took another whole week of hard work inside the cave before the entire team of 5 was ready to dive through the sumps and set up camp on the other side. Jason was ready a day earlier than everyone else, so he spent an extra night at Camp 6. From there, he could explore and plan the route to Sump 9. The day after they spent their first night at Camp 6, they set off towards Sump 9. They had to carry diving equipment for Jason, as well as ropes and other gear needed for exploring steep and vertical parts of the cave. The path to Sump 9 required them to swim and wade through deep pools of water. To make this easier, they used ropes, some of which had been left behind from their previous visit in 1994. Along the way, they had to climb through a rocky area known as Adams Avenue, but they were hoping that by diving through Sump 7, they might discover a different path that would be less challenging with all their bulky diving gear. So while the rest of the team went around Adams Avenue, Jason got ready to dive into Sump 7. Soon they found Jason on the other side of this underwater passage. They carried the gear a little farther, and then Jason was at Sump 9, all set to make his dive. While Jason was exploring underwater, the rest of the team decided to check out some areas of the cave that hadn't been explored before. They marked several spots they wanted to come back to later. Their main focus was on a place that seemed very promising, the Rio Iglesia waterfall. The day before, during his exploration, Jason had found a way to reach the top of the waterfall, a path that Bill Stone had discovered back in 1994. This meant they didn't need special climbing equipment to get up there. They made their way through the rocky area near Adams Avenue, following the sound of the waterfall that Jason had heard the day before. After a little while, they climbed down to the fast-moving stream and started going upstream, but their progress was stopped by a big pile of rocks. They tried to squeeze through, go over, or find other ways to get past it, but nothing worked. They even did a quick survey to understand the situation better. Eventually, they decided to head back to camp, feeling a bit disappointed. On their way back, they met up with Jason, who told them that the underwater passage had poor visibility and was about 98 feet deep. They all returned to camp together, not quite achieving what they had hoped for. The next day, it was Chris's turn to go underwater. Just like Jason did before, Chris had to carry all the diving equipment through the lakes and big chambers down to Sump 7. Then he followed the line that Jason had set up. On the other side of Sump 7, the team helped Chris get to Sump 8, where there was a big pool of water. Water from Sump 7 was flowing into Sump 8, but they couldn't see it flowing out, so they thought it might be a good idea to check if any underwater passages could lead them further. They carefully examined all the walls, but they couldn't find any way to go. So they decided to move on to Sump 9. In Sump 9, Chris placed a new diving line along the right-hand wall as he went down. The passage started to slope steeply, and he reached a depth of 164 feet. After that, the cave gradually rose to about 15 feet deep before the slope got steeper, and Chris started to ascend to a depth of 20 feet. He had to spend 5 minutes decompressing before coming back up. Chris had been diving for about 820 feet when he reached the surface of a still and muddy pool. In front of him was a steep, upward-sloping ramp with a floor that had cracks filled with mud. He was very careful when placing his rebreather on the ramp. Then he started climbing up, trying to find a good grip on the slippery, muddy surface. He crawled flat on his stomach and had to do a short, tricky climb. After a while, he decided that he had gone far enough. If he wanted to go any farther, he would need a rope, and he would have to get out of his dry suit. This part of the cave didn't seem very promising, and it wasn't the main path they were looking for. As Chris made his way back to the diving base, he tried to find another passage where the main flow of water might go. But as time went on, the water became less clear, and he couldn't see any other options. While Chris was exploring underwater, Jason stayed above the water, trying to find different ways to leave the big chamber they were in. He went all the way to the back of the chamber and discovered a path hidden by big rocks. This path seemed very intriguing and worth investigating. Meanwhile, Rich, John, and Myrick didn't waste any time either. They were busy mapping and measuring several smaller side passages farther up the cave. However, these passages didn't lead very far into the cave. The next day, Jason went into the water carrying an 8mm rope. He followed the path that Chris had taken underwater, and once he got to the surface, he took off his dry suit. Without the bulky dry suit, he could move more freely and wasn't worried about damaging it. With the rope, he made sure to secure his way as he climbed higher. However, as he went further, the cave started to narrow down, and there were no other dry paths to explore in this area. Even though their underwater exploration wasn't going as planned, there was some progress. At the back of the chamber at Sump 9, they found something interesting. The passage they explored that day, which they named So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, was a dry route up high. It had multiple paths branching off, and even a section that dropped down into Adams Avenue. After several days of diving, they still hadn't found the main path they were looking for in the sump, so they decided to change their approach. Jason Mallinson would go first, using his old route, and he'd place a new line along the left-hand wall. At the same time, Chris would follow his path along the right-hand wall. They planned to stay close to each other so they could locate the missing underwater tunnel. On their way to the underwater passage, they noticed that some of the pools were deeper than they expected. When they reached the main stream, their suspicions were confirmed. The water levels had risen quite a bit, but they believed it was still safe to continue. They only worried about getting stuck in the Sump 9 chamber. However, the new route they found, So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, would provide them with a way out if needed. By working together and using their combined skills, Jason managed to discover a tunnel that stretched about 150 feet. He noticed a significant underwater erosion feature, which indicated that a lot of water was flowing into this tunnel. Jason bravely swam into this unknown passage. Chris, seeing Jason vanish into the tunnel, quickly followed him. He laid down a guideline to mark the path he had taken, making sure they could find their way back. Meanwhile, Rich, John, and Myrick had been busy surveying the area known as So Long and Thanks for All the Fish. It turned out that this passage extended for 1,312 feet and seemed to continue further. They were happy that they had finally found the way forward underwater. However, they realized that they only had one more day of diving left before they needed to return. So they went back to their camp to restock supplies and brought more equipment down to the underwater passage to prepare for their final day of exploration. The following day, Jason continued following the same flat ceiling he had noticed the day before. It stretched out steadily as they moved forward. However, they couldn't go too deep because they were using Trimix, and eventually, Jason reached a depth of 266 feet. Beyond this point, it was unsafe to continue. Over a week, the team managed to map 5,820 feet of new dry passages in the cave that had not been explored since 1994. Before they began this exploration, Huautla was the second deepest cave in the Western Hemisphere, with only Cueva Cheve, which is also in Mexico, being deeper. The two caves were just 30 feet apart. So as soon as they started their diving, they broke the record for depth. After Jason's final dive, the entire cave system reached a depth of 5,068 feet. At this stage, their exploration part of the expedition had come to an end, and they had only been in Mexico for 3 out of the planned 7 weeks. But they were aware that the real challenge lay ahead. Down at the sump pool, there was a massive pile of equipment that needed to be carried up to the surface. Before they could finish their work in the cave and pack up their camp, this equipment had to be moved. However, the diving team had been spending up to 10 nights underground without seeing any natural light. They were tired and needed a break to relax and regain their strength before returning to the cave, ready to tackle the remaining challenges with renewed energy. The process of removing their equipment went even better than they expected, allowing them to stay ahead of their planned schedule throughout. By the end of the 6th week, they had disassembled all the equipment in the cave, except for the entrance rope. In the 7th week, Bill Steele and a group of cavers from the United States joined them. They wanted to explore some areas that were part of the old route through the cave. The exploration team was quite successful and discovered more than 1,640 feet of new passages. Surprisingly, these passages had been missed during the original exploration back in the 1970s. When they added up all the data from their surveys, they realized that in 2013, they had mapped an impressive 1.7 miles of new passages. Finally, on April 13th, they completed the packing of their truck, and each team member headed home after a challenging but rewarding expedition in the depths of the Sistema Huautla cave system. An Austrian cave diver decided to continue the exploration of the world-renowned cave Cueva de la Peña Colorada, 34 years after the last explorer was there. He began the exploration with his team of dedicated divers, until 6 of them got flooded and trapped in the cave for 69 hours. The Colored Rock Cave, also known as Cueva de la Peña Colorado, is a big cave hidden deep in the mountains and forests of Mexico's Oaxaca province. It has both dry and wet tunnels, and for 50 years explorers from all over the world have been coming here to find new passages that no one has seen before. This cave is at the bottom of a deep canyon called Santo Domingo, and people think it might be connected to another cave nearby called Sistema Huautla, which is the deepest cave in the Western Hemisphere. The last journey into Cueva de la Peña Colorado happened back in 1984, led by Bill Stone. Over 200 people took part, including locals, the Mexican military, and skilled cave explorers. Together, they mapped out the cave, finding 4.8 miles of uncharted territory, with nearly a mile of that underwater. They encountered 7 sumps, with the longest being 1,719 feet. During this adventure, they did something quite remarkable. They pushed themselves to the point where they were 180 feet underwater, beyond Sump 7. This was a groundbreaking achievement in the world of cave exploration. Dr. Andreas Klocker, originally from Austria, started his journey in marine environmental science in Germany. He then made his way to Hobart, where he became an honorary research fellow at the Antarctic Climate and Ecosystems (CRC). Afterward, he pursued a PhD as part of the UTAS Zero Joint PhD program in quantitative marine science. Following that, he went on to work as a postdoctoral researcher at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, focusing on understanding ocean turbulence in the Southern Ocean. His passion for marine science brought him back to Australia, where he became a research fellow at the ARC Centre of Excellence in Climate System Science and the Australian National University. Recognizing his expertise, Andreas was granted an ARC DECRA Fellowship at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies, allowing him to continue his specialized work on ocean turbulence. His fascination with cave exploration began in 2008 when he was working on his PhD. As he delved deeper into his passion, he combined his love for caving and diving in 2011 to become a cave diver. In Australia, his primary focus had been on exploring caves in the Junee Florentine region of Tasmania. This area is renowned for having some of Australia's deepest caves and hidden sumps. Over the past few years, he expanded his horizons and turned his attention to the magnificent cave systems of Mexico, especially the Sistema Huautla. In 2018, which was 34 years after Bill Stone's initial exploration of Cueva de la Peña Colorada, no other group had taken on the significant challenge of exploring this remote underwater passage. During that same year, the goal was set to return to Sump 7 and continue the journey towards Sistema Huautla. To undertake this ambitious expedition in such a vast and challenging cave, a substantial team of support divers was required to assist a smaller group of exploratory divers in reaching the ultimate underwater section. This team was comprised of 24 experienced cave explorers, including Andreas Clocker, Zeb Lilly, Teddy Garlock, Matt Vinzant, Chris Jewell, Connor Rowe, Gareth Davies, Andrew Atkinson, Dane Motti, Gilly Eller, and Myrick Kopertowski, among others. Among the team members were support divers with extensive expertise in both dry caving and cave diving. In addition to them, there were push divers who not only met the requirements of support divers, but were also capable of conducting extended and deep exploration dives. Furthermore, the team included people who could provide support on the surface by dealing with local politics, enhancing relationships with the local community, and facilitating communication through translation. During the 1984 expedition, the team had to turn back because they encountered problems that were too hard to overcome with the diving equipment available back then. To succeed on this new expedition, they had to find solutions to this very issue. One of the most significant changes in their diving equipment since 1984 was the use of rebreathers. These rebreathers were special because they allowed the divers to go deep and stay underwater for longer without needing an impractically large number of diving tanks. The rebreathers they used needed to be light and easy to fix, even in the deepest and darkest parts of the cave. While a few of the support divers still used traditional open-circuit dive gear, most of the divers on this trip opted for smaller side-mounted or chest-mounted rebreathers. The journey began when Zeb, who lives in Virginia, spent months getting all the equipment ready at his place. After everything was prepared, he set off, heading toward Florida. Around the same time, Andreas, who lives in Hobart, Australia, left his home and flew to Jacksonville. When he landed, Zeb was there to pick him up from the airport. This was the first meeting between two key members of the expedition. In Florida, they joined forces with Matt Vinzant, a highly experienced cave diver from Florida who was going to be an important part of the exploration team. They also met Gilly Eller, who was there to support the expedition. Over a few days, they conducted several practice dives in Florida's breathtaking springs. They also had to prepare a substantial amount of food for the underground camps that would serve as resting points for the large team during their journey to Sump 7. In total, they readied more than 74-liter Nalgene bottles filled with provisions for the expedition, ensuring everyone would have enough provisions for the challenging adventure ahead. Once they arrived at the diving spot, it was time to begin the challenging task of moving a lot of equipment toward Sump 7. To even reach the cave, they had to make a descent of 2,296 feet, straight down into the Peña Colorada Canyon, carrying all their gear with them. Then they had to transport this gear over a distance of 3.1 miles deep into the cave, passing through 5 sumps. Fortunately, they found a way to skip Sump 1 by using the entrance to the Peña Colorada Canyon discovered by Bill Stone during his earlier exploration. After reaching Camp 2, which was located just above Sump 7, the real work began. It was time to get all their equipment into the cave and navigate through these challenging sumps. They came across a significant obstacle, which was a massive pile of large boulders that they had to cross before they could reach Sump 3. Chris, Connor, and some others were trying to set up Camp 1 as part of their plan. Unfortunately, they couldn't because the water levels were unexpectedly high. This turned the Grand Lagoon, which used to be shallow enough for swimming in 1984, into a place where you had to dive underwater for a short distance. Since it was getting late, they decided to make a temporary camp near the lagoon. The next day, everyone helped Andreas carry his diving equipment, including his rebreather, to Sump 4. There, he started to fix and secure sumps 4 and 5, which were separated by a small lake. Surprisingly, during this dive, he found some leftover pieces of the dive line from the 1984 expedition. These pieces were like breadcrumbs, helping him navigate through the complicated underwater passage in one go. After fixing the line, Andrew and Andreas continued through sumps 4 and 5, carrying lots of equipment, aiming to set up Camp 2. It turned into a long day, and because Andrew and Andreas were getting very tired, they tried to find a temporary camping spot on their way to Camp 2. Meanwhile, the others spent several days moving equipment from Sump 3 to Camp 1, and along the long path from Camp 1 to Sump 4. Once Andrew and Andreas had left the cave, it took almost a week for all the necessary equipment to reach Sump 7, including the platforms they needed to get ready for their dive. So after 34 years, it was finally time for the first two divers, Chris and Connor, to venture into Sump 7. Connor was responsible for laying the dive line, and Chris followed closely behind him, both of them making their way to the far wall of the spacious underwater shaft. Even though the visibility underwater was about 16 feet, which should have made navigation easy, the massive size of the underwater cave often meant their lights couldn't reach the walls. After carefully passing through a pack of boulders, they descended to a depth of 108 feet and entered a wide horizontal passage that matched the description given by previous explorers. As they continued their descent along this passage, they noticed several other tunnels branching off, but their instinct led them to follow the largest one, heading deeper into the unknown. When they reached the edge of a small depression, they peered down into its depths before descending to a rocky floor at a depth of 168.9 feet. However, as they proceeded further ahead, they encountered a significant obstacle. The large passage abruptly ended, blocked by a pile of firmly packed boulders that were tightly wedged together. They couldn't believe it. The cave couldn't just end like this. They were sure they must have missed something. While they slowly rose to the surface, allowing their bodies to adjust to the change in pressure, they carefully examined the cave walls, searching for any sign of a hidden passage. Unfortunately, they found nothing except for the side passages they had noticed before, which they decided to leave for exploration the next day. This was disappointing news for the expedition. They had been so hopeful that they would finally connect the Cueva de la Peña Colorada and Sistema Huautla, but suddenly those hopes seemed to crumble. However, a week later, Zeb and Andreas came up with a plan to return to Sump 7 and give it another try. They thought that maybe Chris and Connor had overlooked the way forward. While Jim and Adam stayed on the surface, watching the rain pour down, Zeb, Andreas, and several support crew members got busy preparing for another dive into Sump 7. Their goal was to find a way around the pile of boulders that had stopped Chris and Connor during their attempt to explore this part of the cave. Unfortunately, there was no way for the people deep inside the cave to talk to those on the surface, so they had no clue about the sudden weather change. Meanwhile, up on the surface, Chris mentioned to Jim that it's common for rain to happen at this elevation and assured him that it should stop soon. However, as they strolled through the town and chatted with some cavers from the nearby Cheve expedition, which was led by Bill Stone, the rain just wouldn't let up. It kept coming down, turning the sloping streets of Huautla into many rivers of flowing water. After a few days, Zeb and Andreas, along with their diving equipment, reached Sump 7. The water's visibility above the restriction, which was located between 65 to 98 feet deep, was quite poor, less than 6.5 feet. However, things started to look better once they descended below that point, with visibility improving to around 23 feet. They followed the same line that Chris and Connor had laid during their previous dive, hoping to discover a way to continue exploring. Unfortunately, their efforts didn't yield any success. After taking a 1.5-hour break on a platform at the surface to rest and prepare, Andreas decided to make one more attempt, this time going solo because Zeb had encountered some issues with his diving gear. Andreas carefully examined everything that seemed like it could lead to another passage, surveyed the deepest part of the cave, which Chris and Connor hadn't been able to do due to time constraints, and explored one last lead that turned out to reconnect to the passage they were already familiar with. Sadly, despite their best efforts, Sump 7 proved to be a dead end. At this point, it had been 8 long days since they left the surface. Inside the cave, there were 6 people left: Andreas, Dane, Gilly, Myrick, Matt, and Zeb. Andreas was carrying equipment deep inside the cave in an area known as the Grand Lagoon when something shocking happened. The peaceful silence was suddenly shattered by an incredibly loud noise, almost like enormous water turbines had switched on out of nowhere. The only explanation for this noise was that a surprising and heavy downpour was quickly filling the cave system they had been exploring. In a hurry, Andreas rushed back to where the others were. Zeb had just finished climbing up a rope that hung down above the sump, and he immediately informed Andreas that the water level in Sump 3 had risen by nearly 3 feet in a very short time. When Andreas combined these 2 pieces of information, the thunderous noise at the Grand Lagoon and the rapidly rising water in Sump 3, it became crystal clear that they were facing a significant and dangerous problem. Andreas made a quick decision to move to a safer place. So all 6 of them who were still inside the cave decided to go deeper into the cave. They headed towards an area called the Whacking Great Chamber, which was like a huge cathedral, almost 328 feet tall. Their goal was to reach this chamber because they knew they would be safe from the rising water there. However, the water level was increasing rapidly, and the narrow path leading to the chamber had the worst conditions, with only 10 centimeters of space between them and the rocky ceiling. Fortunately, Zeb came up with a plan to secure a dive line through this low part of the cave, which would make it easier for them to escape later. Even though they were safe from drowning in the Whacking Great Chamber, they were a whole 6/10 of a mile away from the cave's exit. There were flooded sections of the cave that separated them from both Camp 1 and their dive equipment, which was located above Sump 3. As the water kept getting higher, they started wondering how long it would take for it to stop. They knew it wasn't a freezing cold cave, so even though they only had wetsuits and Matt's space blanket, they weren't too worried about getting dangerously cold. During that first night, when the water was still rising, nobody said much. They were all thinking about the possibility that they might not make it out of there. Gradually, the water level began to go down. They stayed close together in the darkness, listening to the gurgling water and trying to come up with reasons to believe that every sound they heard was a good sign. As time passed, they also got weaker because they didn't have enough food. After 48 hours, they divided 2 of the 4 energy bars into 6 pieces to share. Meanwhile, up on the surface, nobody knew exactly what was happening in the cave. Teddy Garlock, a diver from New York State who was there to help, had arrived in Loma Grande. He began the tough job of making the guidelines in the flooded cave longer and collecting all the stuff that was floating and most of the stuff underwater. After some time, he reached the main point where the guideline was tied off on the other side of Sump 3. To his disappointment, that area also had a lot of water. He had already used up all the spools he had with him or could find, so he had to turn back. But he left a dry tube with food and batteries tied to the guideline so that it would be there when he came back. After waiting for 2 days, Teddy went back to Sump 3 and noticed that the water had gone down by a good 26 feet. He decided to make the dive alone and extended the guideline to the far side. When he surfaced, he found himself in a big air chamber and 6 headlamps were shining at him. Finally, he had reached them. Help had arrived, and they were getting out right then and there. The total time the trapped divers spent between the 2 flooded passages was 69 hours. It was quite disappointing that the record-breaking task they had set their sights on and had greatly prepared for led to a dead end. Cozumel is a famous place for diving in the Caribbean part of Mexico. Most people like to visit this dive location because when you go underwater there is great visibility to see the coral reefs and different kinds of beautiful sea animals. One of the most popular places for people to go diving in the reefs around Cozumel Island is called Punta Sur. It's located in a special area called the Arrecifes de Cozumel National Park. When you dive there, you can go down the depths between 60 and 130 feet. But it's important to know that this dive is meant for people who are really experienced at diving. Something you should keep in mind is that the water current can sometimes be a bit tricky to predict there. Punta Sur has two main important sections. The first part is the part of the reef that's toward the southern side. In this part, the passages are deep and wide, going as far as 110 feet underwater. There's even an amazing chamber down there they call the Cathedral. But be aware that the currents in this location can be really strong when you're swimming out over the underwater wall. The other part of Punta Sur is on the northern side, and it's famous for its name, Devil's Throat. This is a tight tunnel that goes through the red coral reef. Imagine it as a path that goes downward at an angle of about 45 degrees. When you're diving, you can go into this narrow tunnel when you're at about 80 feet, and it opens up again when you're about 135 feet deep. As you keep diving, this tunnel is long and twisty, and it gets narrower as you get further down. There are also many other tunnels around it that will guide you back through the coral as you swim toward a safety stop. This dive is great for experienced divers only. It's in the south and can be windy above the water. The strong currents in the middle of the water can make you miss the dive spot. If you can't go down without any issues, it's not the right dive for you. Rosa Diego, a 27-year-old woman, and Catalina Jose, who was 28 years old, shared a wonderful friendship that began during their childhood in Mexico. They not only attended the same college, but also pursued the same field of study, focusing on veterinary medicine. Interestingly, their bond grew even stronger due to their shared love of swimming. As time went on, their interests expanded to include cave diving, and they eagerly enrolled in a cave diving training program. During their training, Rosa and Catalina met two experienced divers named Carlos and James. These skilled divers became an important part of their journey, providing guidance and expertise. As fate would have it, Rosa got married to Carlos. Similarly, Catalina found a deep connection with James, and the two of them also tied the knot. The two couples quickly became known for their passion for exploration and underwater adventures. They embarked on many underwater adventures, and their next location was Punta Sur on the Cozumel Island reefs. These two couples decided to have an exciting adventure by going cave diving at Punta Sur. The four divers split into two teams. Rosa and Carlos formed the first team, and the second team consisted of Catalina and James. At the time of this dive, Rosa and Catalina were relatively new to cave diving, having recently become certified and gained about a month's worth of cave diving experience. On the other hand, Carlos and James were skilled divers, with Carlos being the more experienced of the two. In fact, he was not only an advanced diver, but also a cave instructor. He had been to Punta Sur on previous occasions, having explored its underwater caves years ago. Impressively, Carlos had over 650 hours of cave diving experience, making him incredibly knowledgeable about this type of diving. Carlos and Rosa would first dive alone into the Devil's Throat. This is because Catalina and James had a small problem. Their special diving light wasn't working properly. This light is really important for exploring the Devil's Throat, so Catalina and James had to wait until Team Carlos was done with the Devil's Throat, and they would all explore the cathedral together. Rosa, who is more daring and loves adventures, really wanted to experience swimming through the tight tunnel of the Devil's Throat. However, they had to be back together within 45 minutes so they could meet up with Team James to explore the cathedral. The two teams reached their diving location. Rosa and Carlos began their dive towards the Devil's Throat peacefully. Carlos, who was an experienced cave diving instructor, led the way. Since he had previously explored the area, he guided them cautiously through a narrow tunnel. At a depth of 80 feet, they entered a passage known as the foyer. The foyer is a spacious chamber with smooth sweepers and a sandy floor. Continuing from there, they ascended into the darkness to embark on the renowned swim-through. As they progressed, the surroundings grew increasingly dim, and Rosa could hardly make out Carlos ahead of her. Just as her anxiety began to rise, a stunning blue light appeared in the distance, easing their concerns. Rosa felt extremely excited and amazed by the sights before her. The underwater view was so wonderful that even though she didn't spot any fish, she was still incredibly impressed by the beautiful coral shapes and breathtaking scenes along the underwater cliff. They emerged into the sunlight right at the edge of a seemingly never-ending underwater slope, reaching a depth of 135 feet. Rosa had a strong desire to continue exploring, but Carlos gently reminded her that they had a limited air supply left for the dive. After that, they went to the cathedral. They arrived on schedule because they teamed up with Catalina and James, and together they began their underwater exploration in that region. Carlos observed that the water's current appeared to be quite powerful. Regrettably, they didn't take the time to gather information about the weather conditions beforehand. It's important to remember that when you're visiting a new cave or revisiting a cave you haven't been to in a while, it's a good idea to ask questions and thoroughly investigate the current situation to ensure your safety. Taking these steps will help you stay on the cautious side. Around 110 feet below the surface, they came upon the cathedral, a large underground space where there was plenty of space for swimming. The flow of the water was becoming more noticeable at this point. Little did they know that the water's movement was about to become extremely dangerous. As they continued to dive, they realized that the water's force had become too strong for them to handle. This caused them to panic and try their best to stay steady and maintain their positions, but their efforts were in vain. The powerful water current forcefully ripped off James's mask and rebreather, making it difficult for him to breathe properly using the rebreather. Eventually, the intense current pushed him out of the underground space. James attempted to re-enter the cavern to rescue others who were struggling against the forceful water current. It was during this time that he noticed signals indicating that they needed help. Simultaneously, Carlos, Rosa's husband, also found himself swept out of the underground space by the powerful current. James noticed that his wife Catalina was not too deep underwater and had lost consciousness, even though she still had her breathing device. Quickly, he swam over to help her and pulled her onto the boat. At the same time, Carlos couldn't see his wife, Rosa. He went underwater again, swimming with all his strength, and finally spotted Rosa. He saw that she no longer had the breathing device in her mouth. She was firmly stuck among the rocks, and her diving tank was part of what was keeping her trapped. Carlos reached her and reattached her breathing device. While trying to free her, a strong current suddenly pushed Carlos away from Rosa again. Meanwhile, the supply of oxygen was running low. Through his many years of experience in cave diving, Carlos skillfully managed to find his way back to Rosa after being pushed away. Once James was back on the boat, he called the authorities to tell them what had happened. He made sure that Catalina was feeling better before going underwater again. As he went down, he saw Carlos working hard to help Rosa. He joined Carlos, and together they tried their best to free her, but it didn't work. They realized that their air was running out, and James told Carlos that they needed to go up to the surface. Carlos didn't want to leave Rosa behind, but James insisted that they had to go up. James reassured Carlos that help was on the way. Reluctantly, Carlos returned to the boat with James, knowing that they had done what they could for now. A little while later, a team of rescue divers arrived, and they went underwater to the cathedral. Sadly, they got there too late. Rosa had used up all her air. They worked for about 20 minutes to release her and bring her up to the top. Seeing Rosa like that was heartbreaking. It tore Carlos apart. After that unfortunate incident, Carlos never dived again. Twin brothers went on a dive in one of the most impressive natural landmarks in Mexico, the El Zacatón sinkhole. However, while trying to ascend, a series of unfortunate events began happening as their lift bag got entangled in a guideline. El Zacatón sinkhole stands out as one of the most remarkable natural wonders in Mexico. What makes it even more fascinating is the presence of unique classes of microorganisms and unique floating islands within the sinkhole. Located in the Aldama municipality, near the Sierra de Tamaulipas, in the northeastern state of Tamaulipas, Mexico, Zacaton is part of the distinctive karst features comprising the Zacaton system. The name Zacaton originates from the freely drifting islands covered in zacate grass, which gracefully move across the surface propelled by the wind. With a total depth of 1,112 feet, Zacaton holds the prestigious title of being the world's deepest water-filled sinkhole. When advanced measurements were conducted using an autonomous robot, it was determined that the underwater section of Zacaton extends to a depth of 1,047 feet, with a 66-foot differential between the cliff rim and the water surface. The karst features found in this area are truly extraordinary and have no equal anywhere else in the world. Here, there are around 20 unique features, including sinkholes, caves, and springs formed by deep groundwater heated through volcanic processes. Even today, the karstification process is ongoing as acidic groundwater continues to wash away the limestone, creating unusual travertine formations. In the late 1980s, professional divers became intrigued by El Zacaton, turning it into a historically significant dive site. Several divers also set numerous scuba diving world records in this sinkhole. Beyond its appeal to divers, El Zacaton caught the attention of NASA and various institutions seeking a suitable location for scientific experiments. This peculiar site became a testing ground for the semi-autonomous robot known as Deep Phreatic Thermal Explorer, or DEPTH-X. In a successful expedition in late May 2007, the DEPTH-X robot achieved a milestone by reaching the bottom of El Zacaton. Not only did it navigate the depths of the sinkhole, but it also mapped the deepest part of El Zacaton that was inaccessible to scuba divers. This breakthrough marked a significant contribution to scientific exploration and expanded our understanding of this unique geological wonder. Liam Colton was 28 years old, and he and his twin brother Brian picked up an interest in cave diving quite early. At the age of 4, they were excellent swimmers, and in elementary school, they won several medals. Their love for diving made them study marine biology in college, and they always seek out diving opportunities. Both twins had a lot in common, and this made them share their lives, especially their passion for diving. They both went for cave diving training and were qualified for international cave diving. At only 28 years old, the twins had contributed to the success of many diving projects, as well as diving-related media. They did several diving businesses, such as boat maintenance, salvage work, and training. They had both journeyed to France, Mexico, and the United States for diving adventures. In the early 2000s, Liam Colton, along with his twin brother Brian, who also served as his diving partner, decided to explore the El Zacaton sinkhole for their upcoming diving adventure. They anticipated it to be a dive similar to their previous ones, simple and uncomplicated. Preparing diligently, they engaged in a week-long practice dive leading up to the scheduled date. Since they had substantial experience as cave divers, they meticulously organized every aspect of the dive. They planned to use closed-circuit rebreathers. This was because of the advantages it has over an open-circuit scuba system, which include that it is a technology that recycles exhaled air while eliminating carbon dioxide. And since they planned to dive to a depth of 229 feet, this would enable them to have an extended underwater exploration. The closed-circuit rebreathers' efficient gas usage means they wouldn't need to stop frequently. Additionally, nitrogen loading is reduced thanks to oxygen-rich mixes, leading to a substantial decrease in decompression time. Moreover, the gas that returns to the diver after passing through the scrubber is warmer and more moist compared to that of an open-circuit scuba system. This not only helps in staying warmer underwater, but also reduces the risk of dehydration due to the exothermic reaction involved in the process. In essence, their choice of closed-circuit rebreathers was strategic and aligned with the purpose of their dive. On getting to the dive location, they geared up, started a new dive line, and swam along a passageway to the sinkhole. As they completed their equipment check, they agreed that they were finally ready, and they signaled this with a nod to themselves. At this point, they got separated to follow their respective descent lines through the water body. Liam dove in first for a few seconds before Brian joined him. They were a few feet apart from each other, but they were connected with the guidelines, visually keeping track of these guidelines. They had to be careful in their descent because any mistake while diving down could lead to a catastrophic incident. As they continued their descent, Liam glanced towards Brian, who responded with an approving nod. While diving, the brothers needed to follow a careful breathing pattern. They took conscious, slow, deep breaths so that they could optimize the trade-off between excess gas consumption and hypoventilation. These imbalances might result in an accumulation of carbon dioxide. The dive progressed as anticipated, with Brian observing the reassuring glow of his brother's light leading the way. As they were diving closely together, Liam wasn't too far off. Meanwhile, Liam proceeded further into the distance, following their plan. They successfully descended to a depth of 229 feet without any issues. However, some complications began when Liam's rebreather started to malfunction. Despite switching to his backup system, it also failed, making him resort to the open-circuit scuba system. After getting to their planned dive depth, the brothers started to ascend, and everything seemed fine, at least for some time. However, when they were at a depth of 157 feet, another complication arose with their lift bags, which were supposed to assist them in a faster ascent. Unfortunately, the bag got entangled in the guideline, forcing them to cut it free so that it wouldn't be a hindrance to their ascent. However, cutting their lift bags led to an exceedingly slow ascent, which is generally not recommended for divers. Why is this so? When divers have an excessively slow ascent, their bodies absorb more nitrogen quickly, and the presence of more nitrogen increases the risk of decompression sickness. In essence, what this means is that when divers slowly ascend, they minimize the amount of time where pressure differences exist before they surface. Therefore, they will surface with a lot more nitrogen in their bodies after a slow ascent. As they headed toward the surface, at 115 feet, Brian noticed that Liam was having difficulty breathing. He tried to give him his regulator, but Liam pushed it away. Brian then tried to give him his own regulator, but Liam again pushed it away. Liam then lost consciousness and began to sink uncontrollably. Fear came over Brian, and he tried to grab him, but he was unable to hold on. He checked his gas tank and realized that he had just enough air until he could complete his ascent. Then he paused. He was faced with two seemingly impossible situations: to go after his brother but run out of air while trying to save him, which would eventually make them both lose their lives, or abandon his brother in the deep as he saves his own life. Facing a situation that deeply shattered him emotionally, he started trembling with fear. Deliberating between two alternatives, he ultimately chose the latter, prioritizing the preservation of his own life. Casting a final sad look at his brother's sinking form, he resumed his ascent so as to not run out of air. Immediately, he got to the surface, let out a cry of pain, and narrated the tragic incident to the people present. Unfortunately, there wasn't a trained rescue diver available at the dive site. Consequently, they had to endure a prolonged wait of 6 hours before professional help could come to their aid. After several attempts to locate Liam in the deep waters of El Zacaton, eventually Liam's lifeless body was recovered after a painful wait of 2 days. Cave diving is exciting and can bring a sense of accomplishment, but it is important to be aware of potential dangers. Liam Colton's tragic death served as a stark reminder of the risks associated with this activity. Despite his expertise, Liam's fate showed that even seasoned divers can't entirely escape the dangers of cave diving. To ensure a safe and fulfilling experience, it's important for all divers, regardless of skill level, to prioritize safety measures and precautions. Liam's demise was a painful one for his family, friends, and the diving community. especially his twin, because he was always full of life and commanded the respect of everyone around him. At any opportunity people have to talk about him, they are always grateful for the amazing words he spoke to them. He was honest and straight-talking. He will forever be remembered for his activeness and passion for so many things, aside from cave exploration. We would like to thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed watching, take a dive on the like and subscribe buttons and hit the bell icon so you get notified when we come back with another exciting cave diving story.